for us, because as we've grown from one publicly funded commuter railroad to now 32, there's such a big demand out there, and the competitive system doesn't work. We need some dedicated funding.
Okay, let's talk about safety briefly. I know both commuter and freight have diligently worked to implement positive train control, PTC, by 2020 deadline. I share the views of my counterpart in the Senate, Ranking Member Duckworth, that PTC is not implemented until every stakeholder is fully implemented, interoperability being the key. On July 31st, a few weeks ago, you testified before the Senate about the ongoing financial and technological challenges of completing interoperability in major urban areas like Chicago. Can you comment on any ongoing challenges there have been with technology companies working on interoperability like WebTech and implementing the full PTC?
Yes, I can, and I thank the Senate for inviting me to testify there. As I checked on PTC status even this week, I've heard, and I'll use their terms, there's an army of people from WabTech right now currently serving Chicago. So the message got through to WabTech. They are certainly helping, but the challenges for interoperability are still in front of us. As we begin testing with all the 13 railroads we're gonna have to test with in Chicago, it's time, and it's eventually sometimes software patches, but currently right now WabTech has increased their manpower in Chicago, and it's really trying to help us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I yield back.
You recognize Mr. Babin for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we appreciate the witnesses coming today. Thank you all for being here. A question for all of you. In the implementation process of positive train control mandate, have you experienced or do you see concerns with interoperability? If we'll go to you first, Mr. Skatelis.
Sure, thank you. Yes, indeed. As we've had our many meetings and technical workshops over the past couple of years, there's no doubt that the complexity of installing positive train control really comes down to the final stages, which means the interoperability between the railroads and how they operate their various systems. They need to be able to talk to one another, and that's where you're putting together different systems, different technologies and protocols that need to be adapted. So it has been one of the challenges that our commuter rail agencies have faced. They're working through it. There's great progress being made, but there's no question it remains a challenge as they look to complete this by the 2020 deadline.
Thank you very much, and Mr. Derwinski.
Yeah, in Chicago here, Metra is not yet interoperable with any of its freight partners. However, next month, October, we'll be testing with 5 of those railroads, and we have plans to finish up those 5 railroads by the end of the year, beginning to work with the other railroads in the beginning of the year. The good news is that the technologies that we're using and the software we're using were already developed and refined in LA, and so we believe that there'll just be some refinements in Chicago.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Ogoff.
I would just add, we at Sound Transit were up and running fully on PTC in October of 2018, ahead of the 2019 deadline. But we had multiple railroads, obviously, as I said earlier, running on one main line, and not everyone was at the same level of development. Amtrak was progressing at one pace. BNSF and we, and for that matter, Tacoma Rail was progressing on another. I will say this. I think Administrator Vittori at the FRA did a good job as we were approaching that deadline of convening all the commuter railroads and having us not suffer in silence as we were all trying to figure out these implementation challenges, but actually learning from each other on what the industry-wide challenges were and helping us work through those. But that is going to be one of the challenges, is when you put a mandate of multiple railroads sharing the same track, getting them all to progress at precisely the same pace just doesn't always come together.
Okay. And then Ms. Wiggins, real quickly, if you don't mind.
Yes, it was very complex and difficult, but interoperability was achieved, principally because our Class 1 partners, BNSF and UP, along with Amtrak and Coaster, we all got in a room together and figured it out.
Excellent, thank you. Many commuter agencies across the country now contract for services including operations and maintenance. Certainly Amtrak is one competitor, but there are many others. And what are your thoughts on both your current experience working with contractors and the future of competition between private providers in the commuter area, commuter arena? I'm sorry, I apologize. Mr. Skatelis.
Well, what we find in the commuter rail arena, but we also find it in other modes of transit as well, particularly on the bus side, but even light rail. There's a mix. Certainly, our agencies, I believe, are really looking at what makes the most sense for their local circumstances, the requirements that they have to operate. But we've seen with many of the new commuter rail lines that have opened up in the past decade, they're privately contracted by choice by the agencies. And I think that's the right approach. In every circumstance, not one solution or approach is going to be the correct one. It has to be adaptable to what makes sense locally, and that's what we're seeing really in our experience in looking at the agencies and how they're approaching this issue.
And one more question for you, if you don't mind, sir. How would you balance the funding needs of our highway network with the needs of commuter agencies?
Well, we have a very robust and comprehensive authorization proposal that our association has been working on for the past 18 months. We think it's critically important that the issue of the Highway Trust Fund solvency be addressed. Obviously, the FAST Act expires at the end of September of next year. Right. We have a detailed set of proposals that move forward with the highway mode because we think it's important to address surface transportation together, not separately. And so our proposal moves in that fashion. We're part of a unified approach that our coalition partners, including AASHTO and ARPTA and the U.S. Chamber, all support, and that is, for our purposes, increasing the gasoline tax in the medium term. That would raise more money not only for highways but for public transit as well. And we have other proposals as well that go into the fine details of how we would accomplish that, and we'd be happy to share that detail with this committee at any time.
Great, and I've run out of time, Mr. Chairman, so I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair will now recognize Ms. Napolitano for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this important meeting, and I welcome Ms. Stephanie Wiggins, the new CEO of Metrolink, to testify, and I'm glad to see you. It's a major transportation provider for residents and businesses in my district. It has 2 routes, San Bernardino Riverside, 4 stations, and El Monte, Baldwin Park, Covina, and Industry. And I am very pleased the board appointed Ms. Wiggins last December as the new CEO. A long track record of effective transportation leadership in Southern California, having worked for 3 to 5 of the Metrolink member agencies, including San Bernardino County Transportation Authority, Riverside County Transportation Authority, and most recently, Deputy CEO at LA Metro. We need more women in transportation, ma'am. I read your testimony with much interest, and you briefly discussed innovative technologies in grade crossing safety and requests that Congress and FRA support such programs. I am concerned with the suicides and pedestrian accidents on the railroad and also the homeless situation in the area. Could you expound a little on that?
Sure. One of the challenges of operating a system that covers over 500 route miles is that we also have over 400 at-grade crossings in the network. And it's not just Metrolink operating. As I shared in my testimony, we have the freight railroads operating, Amtrak operating, so it's 300 trains a day. And we're operating through communities. And so this issue of trespasser strikes and grade crossing conflicts is of deep concern to all of us in the industry. It was reiterated by FRA's report just last fall. While every area is unique geographically, we have been challenged with homeless encampments in some of our rail right-of-way that have contributed to trespasser strikes. And then generally, I think all of us would attest to just pedestrian distraction, right? So we are working, looking at innovative technologies. We're working with Operation Lifesaver. We are working with the vendor community to come up with different ways to help educate people to stay off the tracks, but also looking at engineering and law enforcement resources. Inevitably, though, it goes down to what the FRA report highlighted. There's not enough funding to address the needs, and we're just 456. I'm sure my colleagues can talk about more, but we know that grade separations make a difference, and additional federal funding would be needed.
Well, I know the quad gates are rather expensive, because I know several of my cities wanted to put them in, and they shuddered when they saw the price on them. The Operation Lifesaver, is it still volunteer?
I'm sorry, Congressman, I didn't hear the question.
Operation Lifesaver. the Operation Lifesaver is still a volunteer operation for employees.
Yes, it is.
And there's any funding for that so they can get more information out to the general public?
We would appreciate and support additional funding for Operation Lifesaver. We were fortunate to just receive a grant, again, to help with education and outreach on railroads crossing safety. But yes, Operation Lifesaver is a voluntary nonprofit organization that seeks to partner with railroads across the country for safety.
Well, those are very important things in my area. The other area that our region both benefits from and is burdened by the private and public railroads sharing the same rail lines. What is the current state of your relationship with the freight railroads?
We are fortunate in Southern California to have a positive relationship with the freight railroads. 48% of our network is made possible because we share the corridor with the Class I railroads. While just as with any family, there can be challenges at times, the opportunities are we're able to add more frequency of service. We're able to, when our goals align, advocate for additional funding, both at the state level and the local level.
Well, if you have increased ridership, will that interfere with the railroads doing their job?
I think the challenge is that we're all trying to grow. But I'm fortunate that our railroad partners, particularly right now, BNSF and Metrolink, are talking about how we can jointly grow and not conflict with each other. Fundamentally, that means identifying the capital projects that are needed and the federal funding that's needed to help support them.
Well, congratulations on getting the work done on the the train control. That is very important. I think we did an extension. I think we're going to do another one. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Chair will now recognize Mr. Weber for 5 minutes.
Is that all? Thank you, Mr. Chair. I came in a little late, so I missed some of the first part of your presentation, but I do have some questions. I want to follow up Brian Babin's question about working with freight trains. I think, Mr. Rogoff, you answered it, but I don't think everybody else answered that, or did I miss that? Let's start with you, Mr. Castells. Are y'all seeing a lot of cooperation between the freight and the passenger trains?
We are. We're seeing a great deal of cooperation. Let's understand that obviously they're competing interests. On the one hand, the freights need to move goods and make their revenue targets and such. Our railroads need to move passengers, and therein lies the challenge that we have. But I think if you heard from my colleagues here, there's a great deal of cooperation that goes on day to day to make sure that we're doing the very best from the passenger railroad side to be able to get the time that we need and the trackage to operate the service. Certainly in the best of ideal worlds, I think everybody here would probably say, if I had my own dedicated right-of-way, my own track, we would be better off. But that's
How about a two-way highway? Would that be better, two tracks on the same path? You know, where you had like cars, where you had one going this way, one coming back? That would require an expanded right-of-way, obviously, but boy, that'd be ideal, wouldn't it?
Sure. In some instances, that might be possible, given the right-of-way. In others, it's not, because of the limitations of geometry and the land that you have available to it. But I think, again, our experiences in working very closely with our commuter rail agencies is they do an incredible job of balancing those needs and making sure that they're doing their very, very best they can to deliver.
Thank you. I'm going to jump down to Ms. Wiggins. I'm going to go out of turn here. I was fascinated. You said that Southern California is notorious for soul-crushing traffic. Is that what you said?
Yes, sir.
Not soul-crashing, but soul-crushing traffic.
That's correct.
Okay. 456 at-grade crossings in the network. Is your only partner, you said you've been partnered, 41% of the railroad is shared, and then you mentioned BNSF. Is that the only rail line that's there?
No, thank you for allowing me to clarify. It's BNSF, but also Union Pacific Railroad.
Just those two?
Yes, those two.
Do you know what percentage of those?
Not offhand, but I can get you the
Okay.
information.
I'm getting my expert over here saying major percentage. So thank you for that, Ms. Napolitano. Mr. Derwinski, is that how you say that?
Yes, sir.
You said you didn't have a lot of freight inoperability, if I remember your comments. Is that correct?
As far as the PTC interoperability,
Right.
we're working with the freights right now to start that process next month.
Do you have a date?
Next month, we intend to start 5 of the railroads that we're going to be interoperable with and be finished with that interoperability testing by the end of this year.
By the testing by the end of this year, but how about operability?
Well, and then after you finish the testing, then you are certified interoperable, yes.
Okay. All right, well, thank you for that. Let me go to stay with you for a minute, Mr. Derwinski. You referenced the 2016 GAO report on Amtrak's implementation of PRIA. Have you noticed an improvement in that accounting transparency since enactment of the FAST Act?
Not really. We've been obviously working with Amtrak on negotiations at Chicago Union Station, and transparency has been one of the key topics. We just want to do for the Illinois taxpayers the right thing, and it's just making sure we're paying the bills we should pay.
Well, you have the camera and the microphone right now, so what recommendations do you have to improve Amtrak's accountings?
Well, I would say, once again, the GAO report had recommendations. I would ask this committee to help Amtrak enforce those recommendations for transparency.
None that you care to highlight?
Specifically, just once
Just
again,
what's in
it's,
the report? Okay.
Sir, I think the big thing is when we talk with Amtrak, there's line items that have a lot of vagueness in it. And then when you question into those line items without getting very specific, you find out maybe there's bills from other parts of the country.
Okay,
And that's what
fair
we're
enough.
looking
I want to jump over to Mr. Rogoff now, if I may. Given your experience in the administration, both at FTA and OST, can you explain the benefits of streamlining project delivery? What are some of the areas you would recommend for further streamlining?
Well, thank you for the question. I have, like I said, 10 specific recommendations in my testimony, but I think as a transit provider, one of the frustrations we have is our expanded service, by definition, is environmentally beneficial. So it can be a frustration when the quote-unquote environmental process is the thing that slows us down. And I think it'd be
It's
worthy.
kind of an antithesis, isn't it?
A little bit, but part of that is just about consulting with communities, and we want to consult fully with communities. But there are some things, that we're putting there. We've got 2 different requirements, for example, on how we comply with looking out for historic preservation, one under Section 106, one under 4F. Surely those can be harmonized. I think one of the important things I noted in my testimony is there seems to be a drive in Congress to get agencies to act more quickly on environmental permits, and we agree with that. At the same time, the staff ranks of those agencies has been allowed to diminish. And I'm not sure it's reasonable to think that we can get faster action out of agencies, I used to head one of these agencies, and still expect them to be able to do it with smaller and smaller staffs. So I think there really should be some ground up looking at, do they have the staffing complement they need to engage with us early and issue permits early?
Okay, thank you for that. I'm out of time. I appreciate you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I will now recognize myself, I'm pondering, recognize myself for 10 minutes to start a second round in the second 5 minutes. So if I can do that, I'll do that, or else we'll see what the transcript says. So I want to make sure my colleagues had a chance to ask questions, and a lot of good questions there. I sort of feel like I've go through this a lot, and I've gone through this with Mr. Derwinski and others at Metra. I talked about the one line, that the BNSF line, that I will take when I'm going into downtown Chicago. Here are a few of the things that have happened in the last couple of years that have caused major disruptions. Train derailed coming out of the yard, blocking multiple tracks at Union Station. A computer problem, which we won't get into, that Amtrak mistake caused, that shut down all signals for 3 rush hours. A freight train dragging utility poles across the tracks and blocking the tracks. More than once, broken rails from the cold. That's just a few of the things that have caused major disruptions. There's falling concrete at Chicago Union Station that caused issues. There are a lot of problems out there, and I think there's a lot more help that some of this we can help with here in providing more funding for commuter rail. Commuter rail is certainly, it's growing very, very fast. And I think more than other forms of public transportation, though I think we need to support all of them more. But I want to start out by asking, we've talked a little bit about Amtrak here. And this is not an easy question, but I'm going to throw it out there. So what would you like to see Congress do when it comes to your ability to deal with Amtrak? Mr. Dwinski, you started talking about some of the issues that you're having about Chicago Union Station. There's other issues with Amtrak. There's a Heritage Corridor line that Metra has that only has 7 trains total during a day. The demand is great. There's an issue with that I've tried to get cross honor of tickets between Metra and Amtrak, and so that it provides a little more service locally, but on Amtrak, and that has not been worked out. So let me start with you, Mr. Dwinski. What would you like Congress to do that would help you in your negotiations and your work with Amtrak?
Well, specifically, sir, on the Chicago Union Station, right now we're in the STB with Amtrak trying to work out an access agreement, but it's been a struggle. We're 89% of the train movements in Union Station, yet we have really no say at the table. So it's been, nothing's for sale per Amtrak. We understand that. What we're looking for is a partnership where there's the responsible parties can actually meet each other at a table on a normal basis and try to work out problems. Now, I'm going to say very clearly, on a day-to-day basis, the local people on the ground do deal with all these problems that you discussed. Some of those problems were major. They really affected tens of thousands of people. And there are minor problems that happen on a normal basis. And the local people, Metra, Amtrak, BNSF, they're all working together to make that stuff happen. As far as the growth goes, the Heritage Corridor line that you brought up, the real problem with the Heritage Corridor line is Metra can't really provide extra service out there because of the 6 freight tracks we have to cross at grade. It's just the infrastructure of the system right now. Once again, create projects that would actually start elevating one railroad over another railroad and start creating these super highways for passenger trains is really what needs to start being looked at within.
All right, we'll get more to that. I want to see if anyone else has anything to say about Amtrak. Mr. Rogoff?
I think it's important to note that, both Mr. Dwinski and I, we have very similar on-time performance levels. When things work well, they work very, very well. But when they work poorly, as in the instances that you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, things go really badly, really quickly, and a lot of commuters are delayed. One of the things that goes wrong is when Amtrak isn't running on time. Amtrak being an interstate operator, when they, for example, send Coast Starlight trains into the state of Washington, they may already be hours late having left California and Oregon. Getting Amtrak to run on time helps us run on time. Also, if they arrive late, BNSF has to, through its dispatching method, still get them through the system. And that not only clogs up BNSF's movements, they clog up our passenger movements. There's been a serious deterioration of on-time performance of Amtrak trains, and I think the committee should well look at that in terms and see if their priority that has been granted them in the law for operating over freight right-of-way is really being honored. Anything that would help them move on more on time would help the rest of us that share the track.
And Ms. Wiggins or Mr. Gutellus, anything to add? You don't need to, but okay. I will, did you have something, Ms. Wiggins? Okay. I want to be clear. I want Amtrak to work well. I am fully supportive of Amtrak and Amtrak service. But I think there are some issues here that obviously have been mentioned. I want to move on to working with the freight railroads. Again, I'm looking for anything that anyone would recommend that they would like to see Congress do when it comes to commuter railroads' ability to work with the freight railroads. Does anyone have any suggestions on that?
I'll take that first. As I said earlier when I was talking about the heritage, that's one of the nature of the problems with Chicago. all the freight trains that we have to work with, 700 freight trains a day, with 700 passenger trains a day on the same network, when they cross at grade, when it's like a stop sign. It's not a stoplight, it's a stop sign. And when the fast car goes through, the passenger train, 20 feet long, it has to then wait sometimes for up to almost a 2.5-mile freight train. So separating these two elements inside this tight urban network is challenging. Adding extra lanes of traffic isn't always an option just because land isn't available. So really it's about separating these things. Eventually, it's also about how the trains integrate with each other. As Mr. Rogoff pointed out, that sometimes happens it actually happens all the time. A freight train's out of pocket, a passenger train's out of pocket, and that throws off these heavy, dense rush hours. Now, for the most part, freights work with us inside our rush hours, and that's where, obviously, the domino effect can really, really hinder us.
Do you want to talk at all about issues in Lake County?
In Lake County, we're stagnated on growth right now. We just had recently an opportunity to look at a reverse commute market. It's up and running, but our ability right now to add an extra train was basically a no. The current infrastructure right now, the owner says no. So we did have basically a little bit of a frustration there where we're trying to grow the system, we're trying to take care of our operating needs, but we're hindered on that.
All right, Mr. Rogoff.
Well, I would just say, in all of our conversations with BNSF are always collaborative, cooperative, but also expensive ones. And I say that they're expensive is when we want to introduce additional frequencies to meet passenger demand. The test for BNSF is what infrastructure investments will we make, the general taxpayer, to their railroad to help eliminate the likelihood that our trains are going to intersect. And that's to make sure that freight movements can serve the ports and also serve us. I think Congress can take a position that recognizes that a robust and functional freight network is inherently beneficial even though they're privately held, especially if we're talking about climate change, especially if we're talking about decongestion and what we can do to keep both trucks moving on the highway but freight moving across the country. At this current juncture, it is all on us, Sound Transit, to make the investments to deconflict our commuter trains with the freight trains. We could get federal grants for that, but I also believe that there may be a way of getting into the funding mix, a conversation of how we can make our freight network more hospitable to all, both them and us.
Thank you. Any other comments on that one? I will then move on. I did start at 10 minutes, correct? All right, I just want to make sure I've been going that long. Let me just, I asked those questions, those are more difficult questions, because I think we've covered a lot of the important issues here. The cost of PTC, and we need to have PTC, the mandate's in place, we're going to hold everyone to that, but I think you've all made clear how much that's going to cost, and that comes at the expense of other capital projects. Mr. Skatelis had talked about $1 billion for PTC, I believe, over 6 years, $1.5 billion for grade crossing safety and Christie, in addition to Section 130. I think that is also critical, grade crossing safety. I would probably would want more than that. I think there are things, grade separations can be very expensive, but those are really the most safe ways to go. And in general, increasing the amount that we give for public transit. But I think it's important in this hearing that, like I said, I wanted to have this hearing because it's been a decade since we had a hearing solely on commuter rail. And it's becoming more and more important in so many communities across the country. And I think it's important that this committee and the subcommittee focus on what can be done for commuter rail, for all the reasons that you have talked about here. So I appreciate very much all your testimony, and I think I owe it to, I'm going to yield back, and I'm going to owe it to Mr. Weber. I'll give you 5 minutes if you want to ask any more questions. All right, so thank you, Mr. Weber. I want to thank all of our witnesses as I go and look for my script so I say all the right things here at the end that I need to say.
Do I need to take those 5 minutes?
No, that's all right. I want to thank all of our witnesses for your testimony. As I said, this is an issue that I've spent many hours going through issues with commuter rail in the Chicago area, and I not only ride it, I hear from my constituents about it often. Every time there's an issue, I hear from members of my family when there are issues. But I think it's critically important, especially as we're looking at what are we going to do to get cars off the road. Southern California, talk about the congestion there, but I'll give you Chicago's congestion, put it up against that any day. And critical also for our environment. I think, and I think we really need in this reauthorization of the FAST Act to seriously not just consider, but put the money up for commuter rail. So I'm going to ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. And I ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. No other members have anything to add. The subcommittee stands adjourned.